Pastor Rich Rutherford, and I'm Paul's father. And I've thought a lot about what could I possibly say to you, but I guess what I would want to say to you is just to give you a brief perspective of watching him grow up. I think that's my role here. And I would have to say to you that Paul was, as I reflect on it and sit back and throw out a lot of the times when I didn't think he was easy to raise, I would have to say he was a pretty easy kid to raise. I'm not saying he was perfect. The one thing I learned about him over the years is the one thing he hated about the house that his mother and I gave him was the paddle I created for him and his brothers. It was about that long. It was a 1x6 with a handle on it. And I drilled several holes in it so when I swung it, it would whistle. And he always remembered that just before I spanked him, I always asked him and his brothers the same thing as, you want one or two? I never heard anybody ever say they wanted two. But if I could give you an insight of, I think, what is important at this point for context, is what kind of a kid was he growing up? I think one mistake my wife and I made is we put a lot of effort in all four of our children at causing them to grow up to be independent and self-sufficient. And I have to say we were highly successful at that because all four of them left home and never returned. And Paul was one of those. And I have three words I would give to you about Paul growing up. And I hope my illustrations are going to be simplistic, but I hope they're meaningful to you today. They're meaningful to me. As I got to talk to his co-workers in the precinct, there was one, we saw Paul about a month ago, and we spent a whole week with him, and all we did was talk and eat the whole time. We had a great time. And I'm very thankful for that time. As it turns out, it was a very meaningful time for both his mother and me. But as I talked to the police officers when he took us through the precinct, and I watched and listened to them very carefully, it was pretty obvious what a courageous group of people that you police officers are. Whether it's in the military, I know my son-in-law is in the Navy, and I know, as being a former Navy person, there has to be a sense of courage, but I saw it more in a heightened way than I had ever seen it before, in the midst of the heart and the language and the conviction and the commitment of the police officers I see here. Now that's important to me, because if I could say something about Paul growing up, it was that he was a person of courage from the time he was small. Whether it was riding a two-wheel bike when he was 4 years old with no training wheels, no-handed. And then when we got back from the emergency room to sew up his knee, why, he didn't lose his courage. That didn't affect him, you see. Or when he rode down a cement ramp at the prompting of his brother, blindfolded on a bicycle. And we cleaned him up from that too, but he still didn't lose his courage. But perhaps the most significant one that really, for me, and I offer it to you, is I remember he was a little boy, and I don't remember how old he was. Please understand that. But my father was there. Now you have to understand that my father was a very imposing figure. He was 6'4", weighed 280 pounds. And he was a very confrontive person. I'll just put it that way. That's the best way to put it. And he was smoking. My dad was a heavy smoker all his life. And Paul sat there and watched him. And then he had enough. And he got up and he walked over and he stood right in front of his grandfather who was sitting on the couch, and he looked right in his eye and he said, "Grandpa, you shouldn't be doing that. Those things are not good for you." And I wish my dad would have treated Paul in that moment in a more appropriate way, but things like that never bothered him. He never lost his courage. And I think that's one thing that we can learn from him and make sure that we understand that the legacy of his courage should live on in us. We all need courage at one point or another. I think a second word I have for you about Paul as he was growing up is vision. I know as a pastor I've learned that it's very true that without a vision, not just a people but an individual perishes. How do you know what to do or where to go unless you have a vision? When Paul was 5 years old, he not only accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior at a 5-day club, but in that same year, he declared he was going to be a police officer. And he never, ever had anything come in to compete with that. Well, he considered being a lawyer one time when he was about 13, but that only lasted a couple months, and he said, "No, I'm going to be a police officer." And he carried that way all the way through him. And one of the things that really affected me is he not only knew he was going to be a policeman, but he knew what kind of policeman he was going to be. And I was never so proud as a father. And I'll just say, when Paul was growing up, people would ask me, "Who are you?" And I had a little saying, so you don't get over involved in conversation, and that is, I'm a plain, ordinary, everyday, common garden variety pastor. And it was quite interesting because I talked to the detective just this week, who told me, he said, "You don't know how hard that myself and others tried to recruit your son to be a sergeant and to be a detective." And in essence, what he said, that Paul always gave him the same answer. I'm just a regular, ordinary cop. If I wasn't on the beat, I'd be in a car. That's where I belong. And he was a man of vision. And I hope you'll allow his example to know who he was and where he belonged to be an influence on you. And the third thing I would have to say was that he was a man of compassion, and you've heard that over and over again, but he was a kid of compassion. You heard him mention dogs. One thing we had in the family is every stray dog had a home when Paul found them. And it wasn't just the dogs. I just remember when we were in a farm church, we tried to identify with the farmers. I was raised in an urban context, and I didn't know anything about farming, and neither did my family. So we started raising corn on about 6 acres, and we started raising beef cattle. Holstein calves is what we raised. And Paul raised one, a little steer. His name was Spotty. There was never a cow in the history of mankind that was taken care of better than Spotty. He went over there, he would feed him twice a day. He combed the cow. He combed the cow, took care of him, looked at him in detail to make sure he was healthy, and even was able to overcome the cynicism of his 2 brothers. Paul entered the cow in the local county fair, because he was a part of 4-H, of course, and he won a blue ribbon. But one of the rules in the fair was if you won a blue ribbon, you had to sell your animal to one of the people that supported the fair as a whole. And so Spotty was sold. So one day I came home from the from the store with some steaks, and we were eating steak that night, and his brothers just tormented him. Well, this is Spotty, Paul. And Paul just insisted all the way through, no, my Spotty's okay. And I say that because those are signs of the compassion as it was developing and maturing within him. And I just want to echo what you've already heard. Why was he a policeman? And I'll tell you what he told me in those father-son times when we would visit here and I would talk to him. He wanted to save people. He wanted to save people from themselves. As far as I knew, Paul never made an arrest where he didn't have the best intentions for the person he arrested. He was hoping that somehow if this person was arrested, that this would be a seminal moment in his or her life. But he also was a policeman to save people from the people who are inappropriate, who are threatening. He wanted to protect people. And so my exhortation to you is the same one I'm giving myself today. If we want to get past this moment in an appropriate way, the most important thing we can do is to allow his legacy to live and not die. And I trust that that's exactly what you will do with what you know about Paul and what he meant to you as a person. Thank you.